Chapter 2. What people call free will. Almost no one wakes up in the morning thinking about free will. People think about choices. They think about what they said and regret it. They think about what they did not say and regret that too. They think about the other person's mistake, their own reaction, the guilt that remained, the judgment that came far too easily against the other. And almost always, all of this comes accompanied by a silent sentence. He could have done differently, chosen differently. This thought is not harmless. It supports a large part of human suffering. It charges us for something we did. When we demand that someone should have acted better. When we feel prolonged anger. When we believe we failed because we did not have enough willpower. When we look at the past as if it were a field of wasted possibilities and not a coherent sequence of events. And this happens because of the common sense we have about free will. Few concepts are so widely used and, at the same time, so confused as free will. It appears in everyday conversations, in moral judgments, in legal decisions, and in personal reflections, almost always as something obvious, natural, beyond doubt. It is said that someone acted because they wanted to, that no one forced them, that it was enough to choose differently. These phrases sound familiar because they sustain a comforting feeling that we are in control. Questioning this feeling usually generates immediate strangeness. And this is not a flaw in the argument. It is part of the process. Every deeply rooted illusion reacts when it begins to be touched. When we try to define clearly what we call free will, the initial certainty begins to dissolve. For some, it simply means choosing between alternatives. For others, acting without coercion. For others still, being the ultimate origin of one's own decisions. The term carries so many meanings that we rarely notice that we are discussing different things under the same name. Among these definitions, there is one that deserves special attention for its simplicity and honesty. The idea of free will as the freedom of the will to determine itself. This definition shifts the debate silently, but profoundly. It forces us to look not only at what we do, but at what we want. And it is precisely here that discomfort begins to arise. Thus, we need to move away from the common sense idea that free will is free choosing. When we observe our most ordinary experiences with attention, we notice something curious. We choose all the time. We choose what to do, but we do not choose the desire that leads us there. Desires appear. Inclinations arise. Preferences impose themselves. Only afterward do we begin to decide what to do with them. Will does not ask permission. It presents itself. This recognition is often experienced as a loss. The feeling of control diminishes. The idea of absolute authorship begins to crack. But this discomfort is not the destination. It is a passage. It exists to tear an old illusion and open space for something deeper. To choose, in its simplest sense, is to prefer. It is to select one alternative over another based on the reasons available in that moment. And those reasons never arise from nothing. They reflect our history, our body, our experiences, our affections, our fears, our values. The choice happens, but it happens as the expression of something that was already in us. Consider something trivial like choosing between coffee and tea. The choice is real. You decide. But hardly anyone would say they chose to prefer coffee. The preference already existed before the conscious decision. The choice only revealed it. The same applies to deeper decisions, affective, professional, moral. We do not choose from outside ourselves. We choose from within. At this point, many feel the impulse to resist. The idea arises that if all this is true, then we lose something essential. But what begins to reveal itself is the opposite. By abandoning the fantasy of absolute control, we begin to see the real functioning of things. And that is where beauty appears. One of the most persistent ideas tied to free will is the notion that, under the same conditions, we could have chosen differently. This idea supports both excessive pride and disproportionate guilt. But it is enough to observe it carefully to perceive its fragility. For a choice to be different, something would have had to be different, a piece of information, an emotional state, a degree of maturity, a perception. If everything were exactly the same, the outcome could not change. Arthur Schopenhauer expressed this realization simply and precisely by stating that the human being is free to do what he wants, but not to want what he wants. This sentence does not impoverish human experience. It makes it understandable. It invites us to exchange the impossible demand for total control for a more honest understanding of how life actually works. This is where the initial strangeness begins to transform. When we understand that we are not the absolute origin of the will, something reorganizes. Guilt loses its crushing character. Judgment softens. Justice ceases to be a demand for the impossible and becomes a process of real learning. What seemed like loss begins to reveal itself as refinement. The initial discomfort exists because we're used to confusing control with value. But value does not arise from absolute control. It arises from intelligibility. When we understand the mechanism of things, when we see why we are as we are and why we act as we act, something deeper becomes established. A justice that does not punish phantoms, but educates consciousnesses. An ethics that does not demand the impossible, but works with what is real. This book was not written to comfort in a superficial sense, nor to demolish for pleasure. It was written to lead the reader through this crossing, from the initial strangeness to the perception of a deeper order, more just and, paradoxically, more human. Discomfort is necessary because it tears the illusion of absolute control, but it is temporary. On the other side, something more beautiful emerges, the understanding that each consciousness does exactly what it can do in that instant, and that it is precisely for that reason that learning, transforming oneself, and evolving makes sense. For now, it is enough to keep a simple idea in mind, without haste to accept it or reject it. Discomfort is not the end of freedom. It is the beginning of understanding. Everything that comes next is born from this. From here on, we will refer to free will as free willing or real free will. In this way, we can distinguish with much greater precision the view this book seeks to convey and avoid the common sense that attributes free will to free choosing. Men believe themselves free because they are conscious of their desires, but ignorant of the causes that determine them. Spinoza.